All right. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Michael Martin. I guess I should say Dr. Michael Martin, if you go by
That's what
that
my
ever.
children call me.
Okay, good, good. So, yeah, Dr. Martin here. He is an author, a philosopher, and like Father Abraham, a father of many children. Is that right?
That's true.
All right, good. So, for people that don't know you, I would say that your expertise kind of lies in an area of study and philosophy and theology that we would call Sophiology.
I would say so, yeah. I may be one of the only
Okay.
ones out there.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yep. Yep. Not many. So a little bit about how I discovered you. Um, I was actually reading the book Meditations on the
Right,
Tarot, which I have here, and I there were a couple parts in the book that I found a little confusing, and I was looking for more information. It was something that the author mentioned about reincarnation, and there was a section on the Trinity and how the feminine aspect or Mary fits into the Trinity. And I was researching both of these topics, and I found your blog um, with that I think is hosted on the Sophiological Studies
right.
website. Yeah.
That's
So yeah, that's kind of how I discovered you, and then I picked up your book, The Submerged Reality, which I have here, and because that was like the thing that I found. Oh, this is how I can find more information about the Trinity explanation and things like that, because you do have a section on Tom
right.
Berg and his view on Sophiology
Hmm.
there. So I wanted to kind of start from the beginning with you and discover how you got interested in these topics of in the topic of Sophiology to begin with. You kind of have an interesting journey
Right.
academically.
Well, about, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago now. Well, it had to be. It had to be. It was right after Meditations on the Tarot came out in English. So that was 85.
Mhm.
So it was probably early 86. And somebody turned me onto that book, which I found pretty fascinating. And actually, when I read it, it kind of blew the doors open what I had thought Catholicism was. I had a
Mhm.
very, I mean, I grew up Catholic, had a very narrow understanding of what Catholicism is. And yeah, actually, I think that's reflected in uh, our various online communities nowadays. They're all kind of narrowly focused. And my
Yeah.
experience of Catholicism was through Catholic school and church.
Mhm.
But what happened with Meditations in the Tarot, it broadened my understanding of what was possible in the context of Catholicism, and because Tom Berg brings in all this stuff from Hermeticism from the 16th, 17th century. He touches on
Right.
Renaissance Neoplatonism. He really interested in the great Spanish mystics at the same time, and also he's interested at the time in Carl Jung and Teilhard de Chardin, among others. And
Mhm.
so it's such a broad, open Catholic sensibility he had, really, and Catholic in the universal sense, right?
Mhm.
So that kind of made me rethink Catholicism, because at that time I was probably about 23 or 24. I had migrated away from the church. I was kind of in a no man's land, just kind of reading and exploring spiritually, you could say. Um, but that started my migration back toward the church. It took a few years, but that's I
Yeah.
remember reading that book, and I mean, you probably had the same experience. I mean, how does this guy know all this stuff? And
Yeah.
you know, just as a piece, there was more to it than just erudition. It's not just a scholarly tome. There's much more
Mhm.
going on there. So that's how it started. And Tomberg, as you know, has an embedded sophiology throughout the text. It's not on every single page, but his Mariology is sophiology, which I didn't realize at the time because I didn't have a vocabulary for that, you know. But
Yeah.
a little while later, I stumbled into the philosophy of Vladimir Soloviev, who was probably the first Russian Sophiologist.
Now, when you were involved in when you really got into reading Meditations on the Tarot, did you also start interacting more with Eastern Orthodox people and Eastern Catholics?
Not yet. Took a few years.
Okay.
It was after I started reading Soloviev that I eventually found my way into the Eastern Catholic Church.
Right.
That he brought me there. I mean, and plus one of the things I liked about Soloviev is he's got a very ecumenical view, and he really wants to bring East and West back together again. And that's part of his Sophiology, you know? So that's when it started, and it never went away, but it never became my life's work for a while. Then not long after that, I became a Waldorf teacher. I did that for about 16 years, and then I became a professor.
Can you explain a little what is a Waldorf teacher? I mean, Waldorf school?
Waldorf education was devised by Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian philosopher and mystic, I guess you could call it.
Right.
He was pretty much a Renaissance man. He had insights that touched on not only education, but he also introduced the principles of biodynamic farming and gardening, which I'm a biodynamic farmer. So in medicine, the arts, he was kind of a very expansive individuality whose interest touched on everything. And it's not just his interests, but he brought his interests and his insights into practical usage, right? So he didn't just have ideas about education, started a school. He didn't just have ideas about farming. He got people to try it out and see if it worked. And so I did that for 16 years and then became a professor. And I was a professor. I did not have my PhD when I started as a professor, so I was working on my doctorate at the same time.
Can we go back to Steiner real quick?
Sure.
So
we're
covering a lot of ground here. So did you first hear about Steiner from Valentin Tomberg, the author of Meditations on the Tarot?
No, I knew people who were Waldorf teachers, and I had read a couple of books by Steiner prior to encountering Meditations on the Tarot. So
Steiner is such an interesting person to me because he seems to have influenced such a wide array of things in the modern world. I mean, you have Steiner being a huge influence on guys like Valentin Tomberg, who's writing about Hermeticism, right? You have him influencing the farming world of biodynamic farming, the education sphere.
Yeah.
Who was this guy in your estimation?
I don't. Well, you know, he's not a puzzling figure. I mean, he was a philosopher. He was trained in phenomenology. He was probably a classmate of Edmund Husserl's, and because he also had Franz Brentano as one of his professors, as Husserl did, and they were exact contemporaries. I think they were even born in the same year, or maybe a year apart. And so his insights really arise out of phenomenology, you know. But his phenomenology went into a more, I guess we could say, esoteric direction than did Husserl's. But Husserl's it's a spiritual activity that Husserl's describing, and that also translated to John Paul II and Edith Stein, among others. And it's interesting where all these people who got involved with phenomenology eventually had a religious turn. I mean, they start off as agnostics or atheists, and then through whatever it was that was shining through phenomena, it made them believers.
That is very interesting how that thought seems to have kind of disseminated. You have that kind of phenomenological thinking going to the West through people like John Paul II and in that Western Catholic tradition, but you also have it going east through people like Bulgakov and Soloviev.
Yeah, but I would, Yeah, Bulgakov, those guys, I don't know how they came to it, other
Yeah.
than through the Eastern liturgy. And if you read
Mm.
Bulgakov's autobiography, he was a complete atheist. He was a materialist. He was a Marxist economist of all things. And gradually, through experiences of nature and of the arts, he came back to the Orthodox Church and became a priest. In fact, he came from a family. His father was a priest, but he chucked it all as a teenager and went full throttle Marxist. But that changed. That changed through his attention to things. You know, I don't know if he was really practicing phenomenology, because I don't know if phenomenology had touched the East that much, but at that point, but definitely his attention to things opened him up.
Right. If you get into Marxism, you kind of have the realization that, oh, you know, this is actually a very limiting way of looking at the world. And you're around that time period, you know, he's probably experiencing things that aren't explainable through the Marxist lens. So I think that
in his biography, he talks about one of his experiences was he was on a train, I think it was, going across the steppe of Russia, and he had this experience of beauty that told him that there was some more going on than his materialist philosophy could explain. Another thing happened to him, actually, with the painting of the Sistine Madonna, which was in Dresden. And what happened with him there, he was in Dresden for something, I don't know what it was for, and he went into the gallery where this painting hangs, and he was overcome with emotion and tears, which is actually also an experience that happened to Goethe and to Novalis during the German Romanticism. The same painting, struck them, and he didn't know what it was. I mean, he just knew he was moved. He didn't have a vocabulary for it because he was still, part of Team Marx. But
right. So he's thinking, oh, there's some chemical reaction happening.
It was a softening. His inner being was softened and opened up. And then he became, he got in a lot of heat, a lot of trouble for his Sophiology with the Russian Church.
So we're kind of we're on this topic of Sophiology now because at this time in your life you're getting into these authors and these writers. So how did you come to understand what Sophiology was exactly?
Well, like these other people I just mentioned, I was a poet and a musician, and and definitely interested in the arts and in nature. And I started to have these experiences in those realms where in fact, my friends I play music with, we jazz musicians do this. I'm not a jazz musician, but we play kind of like folk music, kind of. But there's this part when you're kind of improvising with folk music, and we call it mysticism, because you get into this place where you don't even know where you are anymore, where everything's disappeared. And my wife, actually, and one of my best friends told me around this time, you know what? When you're improvising on the guitar, you don't even look the same. You disappear, and something else takes your place, which is kind of an interesting. And then what that is coming into a contemplative state. And so a lot of my work has been focused on contemplation as a critical act. I mean, how do you, my PhD is in English, and if you'll notice in literary criticism, it's all Marxist or feminist or post-colonialist, and when they all have a kind of agenda that they're trying to discover through dissecting text. So they're basically, Harold Bloom calls them the schools of resentment. So they have this heavy hermeneutic of suspicion toward every text they read. And I, as an artist, I could just reject that utterly. because I think that when we encounter works of art, meaning music, or nature, if you come in with that prejudgment, you already know what this thing is. You already sized it up. You missed what it is. It does not speak to you. And this is what phenomenology does, is it allows the phenomena to speak. And so that's part of how I got into this. And then what happened when I was working on my dissertation, which is on 17th.
At this
what?
At this point, had you written any book of your own?
Not before my dissertation. Okay. I wrote a book of poetry, but
okay.
So I was working on my dissertation, which is on 16th and 17th century religious writing. That's it.
Was it this one here, literature? Okay,
yeah. That one, yeah. And in there we have there's a chapter on John Donne, chapter on Jane Lead, who was the Philadelphian Society, and she was a Sophianic mystic. She had religious experiences of Sophia, of being called Sophia, from Proverbs 8. And also there's a chapter on Thomas and Henry Vaughan. Henry Vaughan was one of the metaphysical poets, and Thomas there was his twin brother, and Thomas was an alchemist and Anglican priest. So, and I noticed. Pardon me?
Well, back to Jane Lead real quick. Right. Having the experience with the female being wisdom, this seems to be a kind of a recurring thing in the sophiological community, where you have all of these writers throughout time who speak of the same kind of experience of interacting with a female being that they would describe as wisdom, and you point out that has its foundations in Proverbs 8.
Absolutely, and 9, and also in Sirach and wisdom as well.
Can you explain a little bit about the foundations there? It mentions something like wisdom was with me before or something.
Yeah. Do I have a Bible handy? I don't know if I have a Bible on me. It's in the other room. But Proverbs 8, wisdom says, I was with him at the beginning, before the creation of all things. Now,
right.
And I found delights in the children of men. It's such a beautiful line. Now, some people would interpret that as personification. But and I know you're familiar with the work of Margaret Barker, and Margaret Barker says no. In the first Temple Judaism, wisdom was a figure of veneration and worship. Now, whether wisdom was equal with God the Father or not, she doesn't say, and it's hard to take that apart. But definitely, this wisdom figure who was part of that first Temple Judaism shows up in Proverbs, and then in the apocryphal books, at least to Protestants, of Sirach and wisdom. She's a very profound presence. Now, it's interesting though that Sirach and wisdom were both written in Alexandria, which, according to Barker's thought, is where kind of the wisdom exiles ended up after leaving Israel under the kingship of Josiah.
Right. So Barker's thesis is that, and the prophets speak about this vaguely, about a woman being driven out of the temple. And they, at one point, one of the prophets talks about her, they prophesy about her return in the future. And some Christian sophiologists would likely read that as saying Mary is the woman returning to the temple, is wisdom. But in church history, you talk about this in your book. In church history, a lot of theologians have gone to associate the being of wisdom with Jesus Christ. Right. So they kind of turn that very obviously feminine language and associate it with the masculine of Christ, even if it doesn't really make sense, because they didn't really know how to deal with it.
Well, yeah, and as if you notice toward the end in the book, I quote Paul of Dokimov, who he kind of rips on the fathers as, you know, there was a debate among the fathers whether women had souls. do they have 2/3 of a soul of a man, or, you know? So if you have that kind of culture, you know, that kind of culture will automatically or find some way to equate a feminine figure in Proverbs with the Logos, right? We're going to make him man. Right. They created God in their image.
Yeah. Well, talk. Since we're on this topic, this directly relates. So, you know, Mary and wisdom and the women of the temple. This directly relates to Tomberg's understanding of the Trinity, which he described as the luminous Trinity. Right. Which, in your book, you have a little section on this. I can actually show the image here if it'll show up. But you want to talk about the shape of that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, when he has these intersecting triangles which create the seal of Solomon and the Star of David, and one, of course, shows the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. But the intersecting triangle is the Mother, the Daughter, and the Holy Soul. Now, elsewhere, he has a prayer, the Our Mother prayer. It's kind of it's in the tradition of sacred parody, right?
Right.
Where and it's a beautiful prayer. Really, it's a beautiful prayer. So he's really on this. As you can tell through reading this book, he's really supportive of the idea of Mary as the co-redemptrix, right? Mm-hmm. And also, he was influenced. I cannot remember her name. Oh my goodness! There was a Dutch mystic, a visionary during World War II, and she was having. If you ever seen it, it's called the Woman of All Nations. You ever see this icon? It's a beautiful icon. And so she was having locutions or visions of the Lady of All Nations, who gave her this prayer. Apparently, Tomberg went to visit this woman around his time of conversion to Catholicism. That must have sealed the deal for him, because he thought she was absolutely authentic in what she was seeing. And in her prayer, how's it go? Lord Jesus Christ, send down thy spirit over the earth, something like that. And the ends with, may the Lady of all nations, who was once Mary, be our advocate.
Right.
Right. And Tomberg met her, and, you know, he got it. I mean, it was convinced him of the importance of Mary and salvation. And of course, that also, you can say, supported his intuitions about Sophia and Sophia's relationship to the Virgin Mary, right? The Virgin Sophia is the Virgin Mary. Pardon me?
Right. One of the things that Tomberg points out is that is like and you know, Protestants are acutely aware that the Catholic Church is on this tradition of, you know, Mary is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? I mean, the trajectory is obvious, right? You especially when you have the Immaculate Conception of Mary dogmatized fairly recently. Right. What was that, 1950 or something?
In the 50s, yeah.
Yeah, and Tomberg points out that Carl Jung also recognized how important that dogma was for at the time. He was like, this is a big change in consciousness of the Western mind, and that got me thinking quite a lot, because you know, the Immaculate Conception has implications, I think, that a lot of very kind of staunch traditionalists don't want to necessarily recognize. It brings up questions of, you know, how can this be, right? Is Mary not divine but also not human? So what is going on there? And you have people like Tomberg trying to explain this. So he's naturally a very controversial figure, because he's kind of on the cutting edge of of theology at that moment.
But he got that, a lot of that, and actually a lot of this is articulated in the writing of Jakob Böhme, a Lutheran. So let's go Team Protestant, right?
Yeah.
So Jakob Böhme is the first one, to my mind, who really clearly articulates the role of the Virgin Mary as the incarnation of Sophia. And of course, there's this idea, going back to Augustine or even earlier, of the created and the uncreated wisdom, right? And Soloviev talks about this. Now, this is, I think, interesting part in Sophiology, is that at this point, you kind of have to let go of the conceptual, because it starts to get in the way. You know, even dogma starts to get in the way of when you try to articulate how this really works out. And I think this is what happened with Bulgakov, who I think probably has the clearest articulation of this theologically. But I still think this is why I call the subtitle of the Submerged Reality is a Sophiology and the turn to a poetic metaphysics, because this is where you have to, you know, maybe let go of rationality and be present, which is, you know, because words and those kinds of logical structures start to fail at this point. This is a mystical insight going back, you know, at least to Bonaventure, you know, where this is the ladder of ascent, right? Where you use rationality as a tool to get someplace, but finally, when you get to the destination, you have to let go of those things because they get in the way.
Well, and that's ultimately what you know, St. Thomas Aquinas kind of came to as well. With the, you know, I think that his famous kind of quote that his work is but straw compared to his experience. I think that's oftentimes a little blown out of proportion by people that have an axe to grind with Aquinas.
They think it's straw too.
Yeah. It's like, wow, you know, I agree with Aquinas on one thing, but I think it's a little blown out of proportion. But I do like that quote because I think it speaks to, you know, there's kind of a hierarchy of philosophy, right? And I think the highest philosophy is this kind of contemplation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what and that's what Gregory Palamas says. He talked about how Mary gave up the base philosophy for the higher philosophy of contemplating the uncreated light. I wanted to bring up one other section that's very close to this, you know, Our Mother prayer in the Submerged Reality. It talks about Isis Sophia. So this is Steiner's verse. Isis Sophia, wisdom of God. Lucifer has slain her, and on wings of cosmic forces. So this is, and it keeps going, you know, wisdom of God, Isis Sophia. So this is very obviously controversial because of the Isis comparison primarily, right? And as you know, I'm from a Protestant background, so naturally I'm very hesitant about thinking about these connections, or rather, I like that. I actually appreciate Catholics that are bold enough to do things like make these comparisons, because as someone from a Protestant background, these connections are so obvious to me, right? And so I'm wondering, you know, there might be something there, you know, but the question is if it's true or if it's correct. So that kind of led me to read into books like this one by Jean Agny, the Black Virgin, where he specifically goes into detail about, you know, is Mary associated with Isis in some mystical way, or rather, is it appropriate to assign the properties of Isis to Mary?
It's interesting, and actually, a lot of people have noticed that as well. A lot of the research into Gnosticism, in particular, has explored that relationship, and you have to at least admit that there are resonances between them. Have you ever read Apuleius' The Golden Ass?
No.
And The Golden Ass, toward the end, it's a really fun story, but it's a story of initiation, and toward the very end, Lucius, who's been turned into an ass, has a vision of Isis. And boy, you read that, and it screams Mariology. It's beautiful. I mean, it's one of the more beautiful prayers. In fact, David Bentley Hart wrote something about it. I can't remember, maybe in First Things. It's a beautiful, beautiful prayer. And if you just change the word Isis to Mary, Catholics anyway probably would have a problem with it.
Right.
But at the very least, you can detect the resonances, and if you can just appreciate it a bit, that's fine. That's good enough.
Right.
Right.
We've spoken before, and we kind of got on that topic of comparative religion and things like that. And I wanted to get your thought on this in particular, because there's a lot of, I think in times when, especially when Catholics are kind of losing cultural ground, they tend to kind of.
You think?
Yeah. I mean, I would say so from the height of Fulton Sheen blasted on the TV, right? But so you go from that Catholic culture to what it is now, and people. I think it's natural that traditional-minded Catholics would want to be a little bit more rigorous and kind of closed off.
Yeah. Bunker mentality, I call it.
It is, and I think that there's definitely a time and a place for that, but I think that it causes people, like you said, to kind of approach everything with an axe to grind. So and you talked about this early on in your life story, where you noticed that a lot of people in these kind of resentful ideologies approach everything with, all right, let me tear this apart.
Yeah, and I was talking about this earlier. You ever go to church and notice why that a lot of times nobody looks happy? Our church is pretty far away, and we take care of my mother who has dementia, so we can't always go to our parish. So sometimes we'll go to a local Roman Catholic church. A couple times we've gone to Orthodox monastery nearby, and I came out of this experience. I keep telling my wife, nobody looks happy. Jesus is there, right? Nobody's happy. They all look so mournful. Is that, do they think they're supposed to look mournful? If Jesus were really here, even though he really is, but if you could really see Jesus, do you think you'd be acting like this? So, and I think that, I don't know what it is, this anxiety that permeates Christian culture right now. And it's not just Catholics, it's all over the place. This anxiety where it's totally void of joy. And that is antithetical to Christianity, in my opinion. And it's the polar opposite of Sophiology, which is the wonder at the splendor that shines through the universe, right? It's attentiveness to that.
Yeah, it's and we talked about how this is, well, actually I wanted to go back to something you said about the joyful versus the kind of somber. There is a I think when I've heard that critique in the past, I think there's a good critique there and a bad critique there, because in the bad critique, it turns into what the Novus Ordo is now, where you have this like Neil Young happy clappy liturgy.
And that's dumb. That's
right. I mean, it's so cringy. I cringe every time I've been to one.
In fact, I was just it's usually Catholics and Orthodox seem to look back to try to retrieve something artistic, where Protestants tend to look around and appropriate what's there, like in the popular culture, right? So like a praise band Do you think John
Right.
Calvin would be down
Right.
with the praise band
Yeah.
or a
No, there's
stage?
a lot of
That was the big
yeah
criticism of Catholicism in the Reformation, is that it's
yeah.
theater.
Well, that's the talking about different kinds of liturgies and worship services. I've pointed out many times that a lot of traditional Catholics will say, "Oh, I can't go to a Protestant church. It's like a show. It's like watching a show."
Talk about
But
role reversal.
yeah, but then like me as a Protestant, I'm like I go to a Tridentine mass and I'm like, well, it's like I'm literally watching a stage
It
play
is.
right now. So but
I don't
it's
have a
this
problem
kind
with
of
that.
thinking.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, no,
if it's beautiful, right? If it evokes the beautiful, but
mhm.
sometimes, as you said, it looks so hokey.
Yeah,
You know.
but what really bothers me is just really the myopic attitude that comes with these critiques, where it's like,
Yeah.
you know, nobody could possibly have a different perspective from my own,
I know. I know.
But anyway, but the joy thing, what I often think about is a lot of Eastern Orthodox saints, or not, they might not be saints really, but think about guys like Dmitri Steniloi, if you've heard of
Uh-huh.
that guy. I mean, a lot of these Russian French theologians in the 70s and things, they all have this kind of just like deep-seated look of like serene happiness about them. And that's the kind of joy that I look for,
Hmm.
you know. Not the kind of um, superficial happy clappy
Not
Novus
the
Ordo.
not the like in God is Not Dead, when heaven is a Newsboys concert.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
that mean,
yeah.
that's not the way.
Yeah,
I'll take the flames, okay?
yeah. But yeah, I think there's a tendency to kind of make the beatific vision a little bit too watered down, I guess.
Yeah,
You know, you talk about the beatific vision and contemplation, and I think what probably comes closest to that is something like you would see in a Terrence Malick movie, right?
I absolutely. I
I
think
mean,
he's the most sophiological filmmaker imaginable.
hmm
In fact, I've been trying to find a way to get a hold of him to send him some of my books, because
yeah,
when I see his films, I was like, that's what my books would be like if I could film them. Because he's showing, even in the most horrible situation, like in the Thin Red Line in Guadalcanal, right? They're going through a horrible battle, but there are still these moments of grace where you see the wind going across the grasses and the light
hmm
penetrating through the trees in the jungle. And you can see the splendors all around them,
hmm
but their consciousness is in war.
I
As
read
soon as you
I
pay
I've
attention to the splendor, it shines. Which is why
yeah I've
the last line in that film
yeah
is "all things shining,"
yeah
right?
all things shining.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read a book. I think it's a pretty popular one. I think it's called the Elder, the Mountain, and the Young Man, or something like that. The Holy Mountain. You know
I
the
have
one
heard
I'm
of that.
talking about. It's about Elder Paisios and some other people, and in that he talks about a moment in where an elder is explaining to him the pervasiveness of the energy of God, all throughout the whole creation.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of sophiological thinking, particularly in the West, is a strong corollary to that Eastern kind of thinking of the energies pervading everything.
Right. Well, as we talked before, this is kind of what Teilhard de Chardin's getting at with the Omega point, the theosis of all
Mm,
things, right?
yeah.
And
Can you
and
can you
also,
talk a little
if
bit?
you read his piece, The Eternal Feminine, if you've read that, which
Mm-mm,
is
no. See,
absolutely sophiological text.
yeah, so I haven't read hardly anything by Teilhard, firsthand source, but I'm aware of the controversy that surrounds him.
Yeah.
And because for better or worse, he kind of has gotten involved in some of these, politics of the church, and it's often kind of a, what do you call it, where you ask someone a question and depending on their answer,
litmus test, yeah.
Yeah, he's a litmus test. What do you think of Teilhard?
Sure,
And if they say he's the worst, then that
Trinity.
Person's an Orthodox Christian, But if they say he's awesome, then you're like, oh, they're a heretic. Like,
Yep, I've encountered that. I don't see what I don't see what the big deal is. I mean, I think the first thing I read by Teilhard was Mass on the World, which is a beautiful piece of writing. Where he's in China and he can't celebrate Mass on the feast of the Corpus Christi, I think it is. So he has this imaginative. The world will be his altar then. It's really a beautiful piece of writing. And the funny thing is if you talk to Roman Catholics, that's when you get the litmus test. But if you talk to Orthodox, he's their favorite Catholic theologian.
Oh yeah,
because he gets theosis.
There's a kind of there's something interesting that happened with the Nouvelle Théologie, that kind of group, which obviously, because von Balthazar and people like that. I really like Jean Danielou. I have one of his books here, random find that I got about the Dead Sea Scrolls of all things. But you for example, I would read a little excerpt from Father Seraphim Rose, Eastern Orthodox guy, and he's like a very kind of hardcore traditionalist guy, but he actually recommends some of the Nouvelle Théologie guys because they are more of a recovery of Eastern thought.
Absolutely.
Whereas in the West,
fathers. That's what they did.
Right. Whereas in the West, you get traditional-minded Catholics that like anything beyond the Council of Trent is haram or whatever.
Yeah, it's true that they have a particular sense of what traditional is.
Right. Right.
It stops at Trent. And actually, part of my PhD is in 16th and 17th century religious literature. The problem in England, for instance, is after the innovations of Trent, these English Catholics saw what had become of the Mass, and they were like, "What's this?" It was so foreign to them.
Yeah.
It was as foreign as the Novus Ordo would have been when that change happened, and they were turned off by it. The English, say they had held on to their image of the Mass prior to the Reformation, or to
right. And I've been to Tridentine masses a number of times, and I read the Mass along with as it's happening, and I'm reading these prayers in English, and it's like, oh, I've heard this exact prayer in the Eastern liturgy.
It is.
People act like it's a very different kind of mentality, but I'm reading the prayer of like God the great physician and all this stuff, and it seems very similar.
It is, and even the Anglican liturgy is very, very similar. In fact, the Anglican liturgy is a little bit closer to the rite of Sorum, which was the English rite prior to the Reformation.
Yeah, I wish if I flipped this around, I would. Yeah, if I flipped this around, I would show my collection of Eastern Orthodox books here, because I have one on English. Oh yeah, Anglo-Saxon spirituality. That's a pretty good one. A good collection of writings there. So yeah, I mean that's pretty relevant to what you studied actually. Actually, you were probably, your expertise is more with like George Herbert later.
Well, most of my concentration was in the 16th and 17th century, but I do have a lot of experience in English mysticism from the Middle Ages.
Right, right. So let's get back to your academic career and your writing. So I put up on the screen your first book that you released, which is this one, Literature and the Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England, where you talked about Jane Led and yeah, I'll let you take it from here.
Well, yeah, there's who's in there? Well, a bunch of people are in there. John Dee, John Donne, Kenelm Digby, Jane Led, and Henry and Thomas.
And this was before this was really before Sophiology kind of had a name, and it was probably more similar to like a hermetic kind of thought, right?
You mean in the 17th century? Yes.
Yeah,
especially with what Sophiology had not been coined yet, but that and hermetic thought, this adjective hermetic, it's kind of a clumsy term. It's supposed to refer to Hermes in the what do they call it? The Corpus Hermeticum. But most of the people who are branded as hermeticists don't have much to do with Hermes. Tomberg is an exception.
Yeah, Tomberg does draw a lot of info from there, but honestly, yeah, that's why the book is called Christian Hermeticism in particular, because things can go really into weird directions with general Hermeticism.
Yeah. And what happens with the figures in that book, Jane Led, I would not call her Hermeticist at all. What she was called in her time was a Beemanist, which meant that was the English word for Burma, for Jakob Burma, was Beeman. They called them Beam. That's how it translated. And that's a good description of her, because what she and her compatriots were doing, they were drawing profoundly on Jakob Burma's work, which was translated into English in the early 17th century. 1624 they started.
Okay.
And
all right.
So Jane Led was that, but when we get to Thomas and Henry Vaughan, if you're going to call anybody a Hermeticist, that's probably a better place to go. Both of them were Paracelsian physicians. And,
right.
And that's what Henry Vaughan made his living, as a physician.
I had this one here, the Archidoxes of Magic by Paracelsus.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we mentioned this last time we talked, where this is kind of a classic text of Christian alchemy, where the mentality of this book is fascinating to me, because it is you never get the impression that Paracelsus is anything other than a devout Christian.
Right.
He's coming at all of these topics from the point of view that Jesus Christ gives you the authority and the power to kind of control nature. For example, he talks about that omega point, the return of nature. So Paracelsus kind of sees his job as kind of healing nature,
right,
as a steward of creation. Right?
And then in Literature and the Encounter with God, one of the people I read about is Sir Kenelm Digby, who was an alchemist and a Catholic apologist. And he also was interested in Paracelsus's idea of palingenesis, or the resurrection of a plant or animal from its own ashes. Because according to the way they thought, if this happened with Christ, it's got to be a scientifically provable thing, right? Resurrection must have a scientific basis, or natural philosophy. They wouldn't call it science at the time. And it's interesting for me, and also in the Submerged Reality, I talk about Robert Flood as well. And I always wonder what would have happened if, at the time of what we call the scientific revolution, what would have happened had Descartes' idea of the bifurcation between spirit and matter not been emphasized? Well, be like, the spiritual part of reality was taken into account in scientific research. If it wasn't just purely, which we ended up in scientific materialism that way. In fact, that's what, Thomas Vaughan he really disses Descartes pretty heavily. And the reason they did it is because Vaughan and Robert Flood and others at the time, what they were doing is they were upholding what they thought of as tradition. Christian tradition, as far as science goes, took into account spiritual realities, and we can say the sophiological reality of the splendor that shines through creation, right? Things in their glorified form.
Well, really, I think one quick comment. Studying resurrection, there's a part in this Paracelsus book where he talks about how the kingfisher bird will regenerate its feathers after it dies. So if you pluck, so it's dead, and you pluck the feathers, and the feathers grow back. So he kind of like uses things like that as evidence of, see, this is kind of a resurrection animal, and it became a symbol of resurrection. The animal did.
Yeah.
But yeah, what? Oh yeah, I was gonna say one of the things that I find most valuable in Aquinas is his hylomorphic understanding of nature and spirits. He's super helpful in articulating a worldview where nothing is bifurcated.
Right.
Everything is, together.
And that's Aristotle too, right?
Yeah.
There is no doubt, In fact, Flood, he gives these illustrations, which he calls the inverted pyramids, which, and I talk about it in a couple of books, where he's got two triangles, one with the apex at the bottom and one with the apex at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And what he does with that is he says, now look, if you have the apex at the top, that's where God is. That's where the purely spiritual realm. But because there's a point there, matter is never totally separate. And on the other hand, if you have the apex going to the bottom, which is more encased in matter, it might be less spiritual there, but the spirit is still present, right?
Right.
And that. And what would happen if we hadn't done that? We hadn't gotten rid of that picture.
Yeah, there's a I think that we can talk about this actually as we talk about your later books. Let's keep going through. So your first book, the book about English kind of mysticism. I have a number of other pictures of books here, so you'll have to tell me what was next.
The next one. Well, the same year the poetry book came out. I don't know if you have that one. The Meditations, Times of Wonder.
Yeah. Let me put that up on the screen. Yeah.
That came out about a month before the other one, I think. That's good.
And is this your book of original poetry?
Yes.
Okay.
And half of that book I wrote while I was writing the Submerged Reality. So.
Is this? Were you writing this, like, what was going on in your life at the time?
Well, it depends, because some of the poems, when that came out, were probably 10 or 15 years old. But the poems, you can tell the poems I was writing while I was working on the Submerged Reality, because there's a heavy sociological vibe to them. Yeah. Quite a bit, yeah. So there's that, and then about a year later, I think the Submerged Reality came out. And
let me put that one up. Yep.
And we've been talking about that quite a bit already.
Yeah. I mean, Submerged Reality is. I personally, I read more nonfiction than I read fiction. I just find it easier to, grok or whatever. But yeah, there's a lot of material in this book. I mean, it's only about 200 pages, but man, every chapter is just packed with like tons of background history, connections to the modern world.
That was a fun one to write. I think I wrote it in about 6 weeks.
Really?
So,
yeah.
But I had been thinking about it. In fact, when I was writing Literature and the Encounter with God, I remember when I was reading about when I was I was writing about the Vaughns and Jane Lead, I think it was, and I noticed that Jakob Burma had not only influenced Jane Lead, but had also influenced the Vaughns. And in fact, Henry Vaughan starts the second part of his poetry collection, Silex Scintillans, with an invocation of the Virgin Mary. So you could tell he sometime between part 1 and part 2 he read Burma. Right. Because he was an Anglican, but he went full Mariology. But
what do you think about William Blake?
He's my patron saint.
Yeah. Oh no, don't say that. They're gonna really think you're heretical.
Well, actually, the next book I'm working on, I'm gonna have a chapter on Blake's Jerusalem.
Well, yeah, because you talk about Jakob Burma a lot, but Blake is very similar to him.
Yeah, they have a lot in common. And I think Blake too. Blake's kind of amazing. He never went to school. Which he said in one of his poems. I thank the Lord I was never sent to school so I could end up in the style of a fool.
Yeah.
But what a brilliant mind. And you got to wonder where he came up with a lot of his ideas, being basically a self-taught man in London, and basically impoverished as well.
It's like the Tomberg book. I mean, this book is huge, and at the beginning he just says like, "Hey, listen, this is everything that I've ever learned over the course of 40 years of like spiritual practice," which is exactly the kind of book that I want to read. I mean, I'm not super interested in epic tomes by people that are purely conceptual. So yeah, William Blake, he's good stuff. So there's another book, Heavenly Country.
The Heavenly Country,
out? Was that after Submerged Reality?
That was like a follow-up to Submerged Reality. It's actually an anthology.
Okay.
Which has some primary sources from Flood, the Jane Lead, John Portage, the Russians, the Catholic Sophiologists. And then in the second section is about 100 pages of poetry, of Sophianic poetry. There's some really interesting things brought together there. And one of my favorites is actually the title was taken from The Heavenly Country by Robert Kelly, who's still alive. I think he's in his 80s, a poet from New York. Beautiful poem. And William Everson, you're familiar with him? Who often wrote under the name Brother Antoninus back in the 50s and 60s. He was like the Catholic Beat. He was a monk. And then he left the monastery to get married at one point, but he was contemporary of Thomas Merton. Very fine poet.
Okay.
And there are other people in there as well. And then it ends with a section of essays on Sophiology from various people, various perspectives, including one by Jennifer Newsom Martin, if you know her, she's a Balthazar scholar. She's at Notre Dame. She wrote a really interesting piece on Bulgakov and Balthazar and the Sophiology implicit in on Balthazar. In fact, right after I published this, the Submerged Reality, I was asked to give a talk at Notre Dame, and I had dinner with a bunch of people, and Jenny Martin was one of them. And her book had not come out yet, and so she was picking my brain about where I got this information from, because she came to the same insight reading von Balthazar. I thought, wow, he's swallowing these Russian Sophiologists, but he is not letting on. I suspect after he saw what happened to de Lubac.
Oh yeah.
After Naturel came out, I better play it cool.
Well, I get these guys mixed up. Was de Lubac the one that he was like smeared and disgraced at his death? Yeah. Which pope?
I think it was Pius XII.
Wow. Yeah. I mean,
but the neo-scholastics were out to get him.
There's this weird kind of rival, like with there's this weird thing in the Catholic Church in general that any kind of cutting edge theology,
Kill it.
it's always you got to kill it, cut it down, and then 50 years later it becomes the theology. Like
I think
like
we should
that's
stop doing it that way.
yeah. It seems like it's inevitable, but I don't know, the topic of heresy, for example, is just in general very interesting to me because I read about, I've read into for example, the Nestorian heresies, and if you read a lot of classical metaphysics in the church, you kind of get to a point where you're like, okay, I actually understand the problem that Nestorius was trying to solve.
Yeah.
Because there was a problem there of how exactly do we explain this, right? So I didn't get the sense that Nestorius was like an evil man that was trying to destroy the church. I thought he was just trying to fix a philosophical problem, and then I think people went really off the rails with kind of enforcing his viewpoint.
And Origin too. I mean, you wait 200 or 300 years to excommunicate a guy.
I mean, it's often the followers of cutting edge thinkers that turn it into a dogmatic ideology. I mean, I obviously do not agree with the way that I think it was Nestorians that, for example, tortured Saint Maximus, right? So it's like I might not think that Nestorius was an evil person with bad intentions, but obviously his followers did really bad things.
Yeah. Well, it goes both ways too, though.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah.
What's it? Marx say, history happens first. It's tragedy, then it's farce. So.
Yeah.
I mean, you can look at religious debates. First it's a tragedy, like we were talking about. Then look at it now. Just a bunch of guys with websites taking pot shots at one another.
Yeah, pretty much the search for internet clout, as they say.
Yeah, it's kind of a theological OCD, if you ask me.
Yeah, and in general, I think I've just grown very weary of perspectives that refuse to acknowledge other viewpoints.
Yeah. And that's I don't know if you're familiar with William Desmond. You know him?
No.
Catholic philosopher, and he talks about this porosity of being, right? Which is something I see in some theologians. I don't see it in everybody, but I certainly feel it from John Milbank and David Bentley Hart, even though David can be a little belligerent at times if he got on his wrong side.
Yeah, what does he call? He calls palimism incoherent nonsense or something like that.
He's really funny though. But anyway.
Yeah, no.
But when you can live with what John Keats calls negative capability, right? Where you don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to have the organon all set up with a place to set everything. When you can be present to a phenomenon, present to an idea, present to a person, and as Derrida would say, j'accepte, I accept. That's all I can say.
I think that there's a difference in thinking. Like in the modern era that we're in now, I think that, or rather maybe it's called postmodern at this point, but I notice that a lot of thinkers and theologians, East and West, are coming to embrace a more long-term view of infallibility of church teaching, where I notice people are kind of lightening up on the idea that the church is infallible right now, and we know right now that we're infallible. But rather, it's kind of a hindsight, right? The the Holy Spirit will reveal truth to you, right? So a revealing implies that something in the past is recognized, right? So
like you were just talking about, right?
Yeah.
What we were condemning 50 years ago is what we're practicing now.
Right. And I noticed that in even guys like Father Sten Eloy, the Eastern theologian, he says things like that about infallibility of the church. So what I'm kind of thinking about with Catholicism in particular is that they tend to set up systems that help people understand how things should be. Whereas, for example, maybe in Protestantism or in Orthodoxy, they're kind of arguing from the margins of, aha, see, I pointed out one instance where you're not infallible, therefore no infallibility, right? But the Catholic Church is saying something more like, oh, well, this is the norm, right?
Yeah.
And there's always going to be little exceptions, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how to think about that. And I think it's best to think about that one in that kind of, is to not get too hung up on the details,
Yeah.
And of course, it's employed in horrible ways as well sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's used as a cudgel.
Yeah. All right. Well, back to the timeline here. I think this is a good format for the conversation. I'm liking this. So, at this point, would your publication Jesus the Imagination come out, or is it Transfiguration maybe?
No, it was Incarnation of the Poetic Word.
Okay. Yes, I almost forgot about this one.
Yeah, which is a book of literary criticism and theory of literary criticism. In fact, the first essay in there is toward an agapeic literary criticism, right? Which is what agape is. But this is an idea I took from William Desmond, the Irish Catholic philosopher, right? With that, and that's as I mentioned before, I really got turned off by all these schools of resentment who pick a stance before they even meet work of art. And so I was thinking, well, how can we do this phenomenologically? How can we encounter a work open to its own porosity? How can we employ that kind of literary criticism? And actually, one of the examples I used in the chapter is from Simone Weil, one of my favorite philosophers. And
is that how you pronounce that?
Yeah, that's
okay.
The same thing I said.
Yes, I always hear Simone Weil or something. I don't know.
It's Weil.
Okay.
But I wouldn't have guessed that either. But anyway, Simone was after she exhausted Marxism as a possibility, she was drawn to the Catholic Church, and she started reading the metaphysical poets. And this is how I encountered it, because I write a lot about the metaphysical poets. And she learned by heart, in fact, she translated and then learned by heart a poem by George Herbert called Love 3. And whenever she would start to get a migraine, she would start to recite this prayer to herself. And she wrote in a letter to a priest that, she would do this. And she said, after a while, it took on the virtue of a prayer. And then she said, it was during one of these recitations that Christ himself came down and took possession of her. Right? So, and that made me think, wow, this is what literature does at its best, right? It leads us not only into the experience of the person who wrote it, right? Because when you read a text, another person's thoughts and words are inhabiting your being.
Well, that's exactly the idea behind memorizing scripture, right? You're memorizing not just any author, but God himself, right?
And that's the point, is that with Weil, because George Herbert's subject was God, not only did she encounter the consciousness of and the being of George Herbert, but in special instances, there's a being behind the being.
Right, and you could also say that. Yeah, you could also say that iconography, Eastern iconography, is intended to be a similar kind of
exactly
thing.
Yeah, and so that's what that book starts off on. That premise is, what if we approached literature like this, instead of trying to rip it down and, and expose it as a fraud, right?
I think that there should be a recognition that a lot of works of art are not intended to have a finger pointed at themselves, but a finger pointed backwards, or rather up, right?
Right.
So
or
yeah,
through,
that's
or like an icon, like with an icon, right? It's like a window.
Right.
Windows. Something passes through.
So this is your original. The Incarnation of the Poetic Word is original work by you.
Yeah, and there's an essay on Robert Herrick, the English poet, and Nicholas Ferrar's community at Little Gidding.
Okay.
A lot of people don't know Little Gidding, but they do know the Little Gidding section of Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot.
Right.
That's what he wrote about, or was inspired him, I should say. What else is there? There's a couple other. There's one on poetry and prophecy, which is I kind of like. It's which I gave as a talk one time. And what else is in there? Oh, there's an essay on George Herbert as well. Okay.
And then after this, I'm gonna guess it's Transfiguration.
Well, of my own works, yes, but in between those two, or maybe even concurrently, I started releasing editions of Jesus the Imagination.
Okay, yeah.
We just put out the third volume.
Okay, yeah. I think this is of the second
That's
volume.
Number 2, yeah.
Yeah. I just really liked the artwork on this one, so it's like, I'm gonna take this picture.
I like that one too.
Yeah. Is it, and this one, so this is an annual, over the course of a year you're compiling,
right.
What would you say, original works?
Oh yeah, definitely. Essays, and usually essays, poetry, and usually an interview.
Yeah. And for example, this volume has kind of a theme of male female marriage relations.
The being of marriage is the name of that one. Yeah. And the one we just put out is what was that? Is Christ Orpheus just came out.
Okay.
And next year the theme will be the garden.
What is Christ Orpheus? What is that?
Well, I don't know how I got on the topic, but in the catacombs, for instance, there are images of Orpheus as a cipher for Christ.
Who is Orpheus?
Orpheus was a figure in Greek mythology. We probably heard the story where his wife is bitten by a serpent, and he's a musician, poet, and he charms his way through his music into the underworld and retrieves his wife. And as he's going back, the prohibition is that he can't look at her until they reach the upper world. But she stumbles and touches him in the back, and he turns around, and she's gone forever. And then later he's destroyed by the followers of Dionysus, by the Bacchae. So that was in the catacombs. Orpheus was a figure for Christ, and then in the late 19th, especially early 20th century, a lot of artists and poets used Orpheus as the figure for the madness of the industrial society, which destroys art, which hates it, which hates religion too, right?
This is the Orpheus comparison is very interesting because Jean Danielou, he wrote multiple volumes about Christian interactions with Greek culture and Jewish culture, and in the Greek book, I don't even know if you can find this anymore, but he goes through all of the citations of the fathers from things like Homer, and the fathers are using these, examples, these cultural touch points, to explain the Christian religion. Seems like that's a pretty common thing that goes on.
Yeah.
So then from here, so Transfiguration was a very recent book. Was this just this year that it came out?
It came out at the end of December.
Okay.
in 2018. But yeah.
Yeah, this book really interests me. It sounds like it's kind of a almost like a halfway sequel to the Submerged Reality.
Yeah, I would call it a book of practical Sophiology. So, what does Sophiology look like if we do something with it?
Yeah.
So that's why there's a chapter on science. It starts with the chapter on science, then one on the arts, one on education, one on economics, and one on our technologically driven age. You know, juxtaposing our
right.
this figure Ahriman, who comes from Zoroastrian thought. You know, this kind of. You ever see the movie Time Bandits?
No, I don't recall
in
it.
Time Bandits, there's this juxtaposition between the supreme being, was God, and the evil genius, who's the devil, and this Ahriman figure is like the evil genius who's interested in technology and controlling things this way, which we can call him Google now, yeah, Facebook, and well, which is juxtaposed with. In my book, with the Sophianic, right? What is real, you know? And we get so caught up in these virtual environments that we more and more lose connection with reality. We don't even know what reality is anymore because we've been so colonized by the technological, pharmacological, what do they call it? Paradigm.
Complex.
Yeah, the complex, right?
Yeah, no. So you touch on all of these aspects of society, if you want to call it that, and talking about is it like practical applications of sociological principles? I mean, I would imagine that
I would call it a book of proposals. So,
for
instance, in the book, in the chapter on science, I'm thinking about what would a Catholic, meaning Catholic sacramental science, look like.
Yeah.
You know, which we talked about, and so I draw quite a bit from Goethe in his scientific writing, right, where his approach to the to exploring phenomena was reverence. So he's kind of like the father of phenomenology. So if you approach something in reverence, what happens then? Where since the scientific revolution, you know, we often speak of subjecting phenomena to torture, right? Goethe called that method the empirical mechanical torture chamber, right? You submit nature to torture so she can reveal her secrets to you. It's almost like rape, right? So, but what happens but how can we think about science most Christians, you know, who are into science, you know, it's like it seems to contradict with a sacramental vision of reality. So what is it? You're only sacramental on Sunday, but the rest of the week you're material.
I was actually thinking about this similarly. Just a couple hours ago, I saw an image of one of those monasteries that's built into the mountains in Athos, and I started thinking about that from a Christian worldview perspective, and because the people that built that monastery, they're obviously thinking about, you know, how can we be Christians in architecture,
right?
You know, so they're applying, you know, this way of thinking to all aspects of life, including architecture, and what they come up with is a structure that meshes into nature, and it becomes one with it.
And that's basic. That's kind of what I'm trying to do in the book, is at least bring up some proposals or some things for people to think about that get beyond the kind of stuck dialectic we find ourselves in, especially in the chapter on economics. If you say you don't like capitalism, people assume you're a Marxist. If you say you don't like Marxism, people assume you're a capitalism. Can we get beyond that already?
Yeah.
Is there another way?
Yeah. Well, that's the project that many are part of right now. You know, trying to the famous, you know, third option, right?
Right.
Well, this is all great stuff. I've really enjoyed our talk here. There's a lot more that we could talk about. I could get into a lot more depth, but Yeah, thank you so much for talking to me and coming on the show, and
Thank you, Kale.
we'll yeah, absolutely, we'll be in
Been a lot
touch.
of fun.
All right,
God,
thank
God
you.
love you. Take care.